why do you care? You care by default because you exist. Games exist for you to care. People and characters exist for you to potentially connect with them. The Last of Us 1 made you connect with a man who had lost everything and had no reason to care anymore. His daughter was murdered. The world turned upside down faster than you can say COVID-19. It was a masterful narrative, full of moral ambiguity, paired back with some dated game design by today's standards, but combined with some brutal slices of fictional realism that intertwined with the gameplay and its two main characters, Joel and Ellie, made for a timeless experience that is until The Last of Us Part 2. Many people love The Last of Us 1 in some way, but it all started and ended with the characters. They were some of the most quote-unquote real personalities that you can conjure up in a setting like this. Even The Walking Dead struggled with that at times throughout its very long runtime. While this isn't a traditional review but more of a critical analysis, there are major spoilers and it's intended for people who have already played it or haven't but are interested in knowing more regardless. While there has been drama around the game itself, I'm gonna be purely focusing on the game. So what happens when you murder one of those characters in a sequel that took several years to come out, that character being Joel, and in turn, murder away some of what people loved? Well, you might have seen what already. No, but really, this is an unbiased narrative. It plays with your expectations a lot better than I thought it would. Yes, it's subverted my expectations despite knowing some of the leaks, which I initially did not like at all and was put off by them. But after playing this game from start to finish, I completely understand why it is praised, and I want to praise it fairly myself. This narrative refuses to pander to the single unified audience that loved the first game, but it doesn't mean that it's disrespectful or an insult to the act of storytelling and the characters within. It also doesn't mean that you can't be critical of it. On the other hand, there needs to be more context behind every person's reviews. What their history is with the franchise, if any, how much they even like the genre or the elements from it. Comparisons need to be made, but you also need to point out how it fits within the narrative, if there is one, all without dragging out the information you're trying to get across. The game being unbiased means it's a very structured experience. If ludonarrative dissonance is a legitimate criticism, then Naughty Dog took it to heart because this game is ludonarrative harmony, and it's all the better for it. If you don't know what that means, it's a way to point out how the gameplay doesn't fit in within the context of the story. Sometimes it's for the sake of fun gameplay, for others it's just not a big focus. For some unrelated but similar comparisons regarding the concept itself, in Red Dead Redemption 2 you can affect your morality for the sake of the story by doing quote-unquote good and bad deeds, but it's a mechanic, it's not rooted into the core of everything. That's not really feasible in an open world game. And Resident Evil 2's remake were really most REs. You can repeatedly get bitten and heal yourself at no cost to the narrative, despite the viruses always being at the core of everything. But in Part 2, there is practically no disconnection between the accuracy of the story and the gameplay. Aside from how you acquire character-specific upgrades, which is done by pills or drugs that you collect, among some other minor things that don't really affect the immersion here. But it still manages to be brutally fun and enjoyable, even if it can border on sadistic. The game doesn't throw out a Hotline Miami reference for no reason when it comes to the gameplay. Ellie is still immune to the cordyceps virus, but even if you get your throat yeeted out during gameplay, whether you're controlling her or someone else, it's usually instant death. The brutality in general is hardly matched or comparable with other games, and the tone is embedded throughout. But it is self-aware and it doesn't overdo it the wrong way. Fighting humans is also exciting because of the AI on harder difficulties and how they are connected in the story context itself. So what makes it unique and fitting? Well, you've gotta take risks to be unique, and I honestly do believe that most of them worked here. While the plot indulges too much in exposition to make you know things that you already possibly know, like senseless violence being bad, it works despite of any pacing mishaps. This isn't a safe narrative, it has things to say, whether you like them or not. If you give it a chance with an open mind, it will very likely resonate with you in some way if you care about philosophical and compelling character development. The biggest example of that comes at around the halfway point of the game and afterwards, but it ultimately plants the seeds in the beginning hours. It eases you in with Joel's return and slowly but harshly presents the new reality. You get placed into the shoes of Ellie and her new relationships that she's had over the past few years from the last game, which you know little about initially. Perspective is a big word here, and that brings us to you assuming control of a character you know very little about around the halfway point of the game. But for now, that character, Abby, golf clubs your favorite character to death, that being Joel.
You don't get to rush this.
With presumably other sad excuses for human beings surrounding him and Ellie herself. Before we move on, I want to talk about how believable or not Joel's death is handled. You initially take control of Abby in the first couple hours, and unless you haven't seen some of the leaks, you won't know why. But the chance encounter of her meeting Joel and Tommy is done well enough. She was on the run from a horde and happened to be saved by them while she was looking for them. So far, it's believable enough. What isn't is why two veteran survivors fall for a trap as flat as "let's go back to my place with my people." Granted, it makes more sense because it was Tommy who told Abby their names, and he isn't as cynical or jaded of a survivor as Joel is. However, you can see Joel's reaction or lack thereof. He looked very skeptical and anxious. He should have done something before it was too late. But the setup and the execution work, literally. I still don't understand why they chose a golf club as the murder tool. I guess we'll never know if there is any real meaning to it. Either way, you will feel conflicted. Ellie is traumatized and scarred, angry and torn apart from the inside for the majority of the story. You carry out said anger towards the people responsible and ones that may have had nothing to do with Joel's death. Revenge has twisted her sense of life, but it makes sense. She still retains her personality and sarcastic nature to whatever extent that she can. Selflessness can be infectious, but so can selfishness. Ellie is at war with her emotions or lack thereof even when she has other people to care about. Incapable of finding any kind of closure, it is cleverly expanded upon in her distraught journal. More on that later. Despite all of these raw emotions, the game is creative, even more so than pretty much any previous game Naughty Dog has made. Two sides of the same coin has probably never rung more true for a fictional narrative than it does here. The story is divided into 3 days per character with prologues and epilogues, with flashbacks in between which have time jumps for each, ultimately climaxing with one another. There ultimately are too many flashbacks for the sake of exposition, but some of the best character interactions lie in them, like the museum trip during Ellie's birthday. The goal of this flashback is that there is no goal. It has you exploring a museum and its outskirts with Joel and Ellie on her birthday full of dinosaurs and space-related exhibits with heartwarming dialogue between them. It shows how they presumably trust each other more as father and daughter figures than they do at the end of the first game. Examples being our Ellie going off on her own and even swimming, something that she couldn't do at all before, and the game makes fun of it.
Joel, look! Wanna give me a ride?
Those days are long gone, kiddo.
It isn't until the end of the flashback where things become more gray as they throw some misleading items to make you believe that a combat encounter is coming up, only for the expectation to be shattered by a wild boar that reveals a firefly symbol with the word liars painted beneath. It injects intense awkwardness back into the picture only to show how little progress they have made, with Joel being entirely truthful with Ellie. It isn't until another emotional flashback that has Ellie confronting him about his lies which entails the first step towards forgiveness. There are a lot of small things that you can pick up on related to the story, whether it's notes, optional dialogue, animations like Ellie refusing to look at herself in the mirror, and so on. The first half of the narrative has you gathering intel about the group that Abby was with, the goal of this ultimately being revenge. There is no real debate. They have to die for what they've done, and you're in complete agreement with the characters at that point, but every person is a hero of their own story. It personally took me 35 hours to beat the game the first time around, set on hard difficulty, while really taking my time with it, so for the sake of simplicity, at least part of the story takes up around 15 hours or so depending on the person obviously. The pacing does have some issues as I mentioned, but I feel that it is ultimately a necessary cost for the characters that you may not want to know but should, because Abby's character arc just wouldn't work otherwise. Some of the other flashbacks are also scattered around with set context to Joel's decision at the end of the first game and other relative plot points, which can be considered fan service but also a necessity. Those scenes are done impeccably well, and the effort to make you understand more of Abby's revenge tale in her flashbacks is done relatively well, but it goes to show that her accomplished revenge has not truly helped her despite her trying to hide that fact. Pretty much all of the characters throughout the long runtime are acted with care, which help sell and push this context. But the main reason as to why the story works is because of the parallels to the first game, and how Abby grows as a character in an effort to get empathy from you, as you initially truly don't feel any sympathy or empathy for her, and you do believe that you won't ever really care for her in any way. Abby's introduction to her revenge reasoning has you in a flashback when her father was still alive, the man who was supposed to find a cure from Ellie's immunity. But as the first game's ending displayed the false logic in that goal, he was murdered by Joe because there was no guarantee for a cure in a broken world. That is Abby's motivation for revenge. Joel isn't disrespected or demonized because that decision holds just as much truth or doubt. For a post-apocalyptic setting, it avoids tropes just as well as the first game. The parallel in Abby's overall story is that she eventually loses everything she has ever cared for. Ellie and you yourself destroy parts of her life one by one. The story attempts to humanize the group of people that Abby is involved with by many flashbacks and showing her perspective during the 3 days that Ellie has spent hunting her. Those days are now from the complete perspective of Abby. The problem here is that it starts off way too slow and makes a bad first impression, but stick with it. The point of this is to show that every person is in theoretical fact a hero of their own story. She had already lost people that she cared for before Ellie steps in and afterwards. A famous quote from Joel in the first game is as follows.
You don't understand.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And you, no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for.
Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
That holds especially true for Abby more than it does for Ellie at this point. Even though Ellie has Dina and Tommy to care for, they get pushed to the sidelines. People that she knows continue to die, like Jesse, but that only motivates her more. Perhaps where the game tried to juggle too much is in its lore. There are two main humanoid factions that play into the story, the Wolves and the Seraphites, also known as Scars. You only get bits and pieces of context about them from Ellie's perspective, but Abby is actively engaged in struggles with them while she is with the Wolves. For the sake of getting my point across, I won't delve deep into the lore for both of them. Instead, I'll present you with a choice. Would you care for what's dear to you, or what the right thing to do is according to others? Abby ultimately loses everything either because of Ellie or the Seraphites, except 2 kids who go by the names of Lev and Yara. She becomes fixated on protecting them after being kidnapped by the Seraphites because of their cultist nature and escaping in the dead of night. You know nothing about them initially, both the faction and the kids themselves, but you do find out that they are Seraphites themselves. The difference being is that they are on the run from their own people. Lev is the more interesting of the two, his true name being Lily. He had shaved his head because of his conflicting sexuality. Before this game's release, one of the written leaks suggested that this is a homophobic cult, and that is simply not the case, and these topics are rarely brought up unless needed. I never felt like there was any agenda being pushed here unless you count the big book of gay. The game does not take a page out of David Lynch's style of narrative. Many, if not all, plot points are explored to some extent and have meaning. Abby's fear of heights, Ellie's psychological trauma, Dina's pregnancy, the internal struggle of Abby's group, the list goes on. There are, however, certain things that are merely touched on, like the Seraphites' deceased and former leader. She repeatedly appears in Abby's half of the story in graffiti, iconography, quotes, and prayers. The most background we get is when Lev talks about her, but it ultimately isn't as consequential as some of the other plot threads that I mentioned. All of this leads into an interesting and intense climax between the 2 factions. Abby betrays her people for the sake of protecting Yara and Lev. She understands how pointless and senseless the violence is. It has no meaning. And Yara's death by the wolves has no meaning. All she has left is Lev, and the only goal is surviving the nonsensical chaos looming over them. I was expecting tasteless violence, but I wasn't expecting this wholesome perspective on it. You ultimately do feel empathy for Abby and some of the people she has tied to, but not sympathy, not until the last couple hours of the game. Owen and Mel, Manny, Nora, Hotline Miami, PS Vita Girl, these people among others have relatively honest personalities and lives that you see throughout. Owen, who is Abby's lover, and Mel, who is pregnant with Owen's child, are by no means saints, but they are comparatively the most innocent characters in her group. Ellie murders them during a storm, a literal and psychological one. It was senseless but needed. Everyone except for one involved with Joel's death paid with their lives one way or another. During Abby's perspective, you do see some of those deaths and her reactions to them, but her screen time is ultimately focused around Lev after Yara dies at the hands of the factions, and for good reason. It is ultimately the peak of feeling sympathy for Abby and her struggles as they escape a pointless war like all others. They arrive back to see Owen and Mel gutted. Abby is completely encapsulated with anger, but not Lev, despite just losing his sister. Ellie clumsily drops the map during these 2 murders, and that allows for Abby to trace her back to the hideout at the theater, which is established during the end of Day 1 in Seattle. While it can be argued that it's too clumsy for the sake of it, as it was Tommy who finds Ellie at the scene and pulls her out of there, it works as a plot device. This is the setup for the final act of the story. 2 female survivors who only wish to extinguish the life that has sabotaged theirs in a world crazier than the one in 2020. Except now they have very little to live for, but it is ultimately enough. As the next climax approaches at the theater from the perspective of Abby, not Ellie, this will technically be Day 4 of Seattle. You fight Ellie during a cheeky as fuck boss battle, which truly shows how cunning she is because her actions mirror those of yours when you were in control. She ultimately doesn't stand much of a chance face to face, and as Abby is about to truly kill her and pregnant Dina, who tries but fails to help because plot armor, Lev manages to remind her of her humanity, even though Ellie killed Mel, who is also pregnant. Abby shows restraint and warns them off to never show up again. As Tommy is presumably dead but not, a time skip establishes Ellie and Dina with her newborn child in a new home with new hope. But it ultimately isn't enough. Ellie is in psychological turmoil dealing with PTSD, intrusive thoughts, and crippling anxiety. The journal that I mentioned earlier is a way to have a closer look at a character's thoughts, including those in the flashbacks with Joe and Ellie. And while it may not sound particularly new, it is done tastefully. Haunting visions can be terribly cheap, but this is definitely in the top 5 I have seen for any narrative. As you finish up the evening stroll and round up a boarded up and enclosed farm life, you, or at least I, truly felt unease as you round up a cute sheep strangler that is hiding in the back of the barn as a shovel gets knocked over and it exalts a loud metal noise. She begins trembling and seeing Joel's bloody face, hearing and imagining him screaming for her help. It was highly effective as a reminder for what was and still is. Joel's killer is still alive. Tommy is alive. Dina is alive. One of them has tried to move on, but it's not Tommy. He has a lead on Abby, and the vocal temptations rile Ellie from the inside. She contemplates packing her murder tools amidst a sleepless night. Dina attempts to convince her out of it, but no matter how much she shows her understanding, the pain without closure is too much. The epilogue takes place in Santa Barbara. Abby and Lev are searching for leads on the scattered Fireflies, the faction which she and her father belonged to from the first game. They find a radio and use Firefly call signs. The hopeful mood is very quickly interrupted as they get kidnapped by the Rattlers, a different faction that has occupied the surrounding territory. The Rattlers are basically slavers who have set up outposts protected by armed guards and chained zombies, very reminiscent of Negan's compound in The Walking Dead.
I ain't gonna lie.
There isn't much in the way of context about them because the game is at the final stretch with Ellie's off-screen journey to Santa Barbara and her finally arriving at the last sightings of Abby and Lev as explained by Tommy earlier. That journey presumably took a couple of months because of how you learn where Abby is exactly. As Ellie falls into a sneaky beaky trap, she pulls a reverse Uno card and traps a bitch Rattler into an interrogation. They lead on that she's been in their custody for months, along with Lev.
Something funny?
Looks like you shit your pants.
Fuck you say?
Oh, bitch.
This is the climax. You feel it in the location, the gameplay, and the characters. It's a stark contrast from the first game's mellow final stretch. If this was a repeat of that, it wouldn't work. You practically make your way through Negan's compound,
By practically, you mean not really.
then ultimately find Abby tied up and borderline crucified on the beach, completely broken, hardly resembling her past self. Her mind and muscles have both been drained. Similar can be said for Ellie herself. She is completely exhausted, but the traumatic sight of Joel is an endless reminder. She frees Abby and Lev, but forces a fight onto her even though she doesn't want to do it. So Ellie threatens Lev and the final fight ensues. I love this. Mechanically, it isn't much different from the previous one-on-one melee fights, but the context of two broken women fighting for survival and because of psychological turmoil is pretty much golden here. It's brutal, intense, and depending on how you feel thus far, you might not, or shall I say, shouldn't want Abby dead. Ellie suddenly remembers her innocence in Joel's guitar lessons, her attempts to forgive Joel's lies, and his sacrifices. She understands that Abby isn't that much different from Joel himself right now because of her fixation on protecting someone else. Ellie lets her go. You might think this defeats the purpose of her chasing revenge, but it doesn't. My first reaction to this wasn't detrimental. It didn't make me think it was cheap or cheesy. It makes sense. Abby has arguably paid for her mistakes, and the trauma she has mirrors that of Ellie's. Neither of them truly want to off one another anymore. Joel in the first game was a man who lived on because of obligation. He didn't want to kill himself, but he didn't really want to live either. He hardly cared at all about anything until he met Ellie, whom he wanted to push away initially, but very slowly bonded with her throughout the whole game. That's storytelling, people. I'm not saying that you need a fucking high IQ to understand Rick and Morty here. I get that some won't like it regardless of how open-minded they are, but that's ultimately what art is. The voice actors and the other people who worked on it certainly don't deserve serious insults and fucking death threats. That's low IQ and insane. The sane could argue that it's not cleverly written and it's self-absorbed, but I don't see it that way in the end. For what it's worth, Neil stated that for half of the game's development Abby did die. If that was her final choice, it would have felt very differently and it would probably doom Lev. They could have easily had a safe and predictable journey instead with some actually cheesy heroism. Or even if you keep in and try and alter Joel's death, something just gets lost in the process. This is what the story should be. This is coming from someone who was so irritated by the leaks that I started writing my own fanfiction story afterwards. It is risky and written with care. That is the core of the plot, but this is a long game. While parts of it could have been altered or changed for better pacing, it's the end result that matters. The ending itself is sad and somber, but also a little hopeful. Dina has packed up and left by the time Ellie returns without two fingers. She remembers the last conversation with Joel where they truly come to terms and have a proper send-off discussion regarding the first game's ending. Joel could have used more screen time here outside of flashbacks, but what there is overall is enough. Ellie leaves the guitar that was given to her and presumably heads back to Jackson to try and salvage life itself, which is something we all do at various points. I don't think this needs a part 3, and there probably won't be one anyway. But the multiplayer is still on the table, which brings us to the final points of note, the gameplay itself and how it ties it all together.
Hot diggity dog!
This is an evolution of a combat system done right. Some people say it's too similar to the first game. I say fuck that. The Last of Us 1 had good gameplay, but it is dated. It had inconsistent stealth mechanics, stupid AI at times, and boring traversal puzzles. A personal belief of mine about good combat is that most of it comes down to level design and the environment that you and the AI engage with. To do that, you need open-ended arenas with the ability to make micro choices. Player choice here does mean something, but it doesn't apply it in the way that you might think. You can stealth your way through entire areas, but why would you? Aggressive gameplay is effective on all difficulties, and you are rewarded for it, both in the spectacle and the resources you gather. A common mistake in combat system is making mechanics and playstyles irrelevant or ineffective on harder settings. It's double-edged, but this game has one edge, and it's damn good. You can tweak each individual aspects of that edge. You can set it on the hardest and leave it at that. The AI is extra aggressive, you have less freedom when it comes to resource usage, but it doesn't stop there. If you want the AI to be at the top of their game, it can be, all while having very lenient resource management. But what can you do with them? Well, pretty much anything that you can think of. It seemed laughable that they were advertising a dedicated jump button, but it all adds up. Going prone, jumping into prone from a sprint, aiming while prone, grabbing a human shield, throwing bombs and setting traps, breaking line of sight, a melee system that actually works with a dodge button that doesn't guarantee success, but it can be consistently mastered. It is peak third-person gameplay that does Resident Evil better than Resident Evil itself. Comparisons can be made to Metal Gear Solid, even if minor ones. Aiming and controlling weapons without auto-aim is great. The accessibility and control options are through the roof. You can even beat the game if you're blind, according to the devs and someone who actually did it. That's how good it is. Ellie and Abby both have their own sets of weapons, which is unfortunately double-edged, but it fortunately gives you a reason to care about their playstyles. Abby is more like Joel. She has limited shiv usage for clickers, a crossbow, flamethrower, assault rifle, and a single-shot pistol among some others. Ellie has the weaker arsenal but better stealth options. She doesn't have any of the weapons that I just mentioned. Hers are more traditional, but it makes sense. Ellie's gameplay is more arena-based. Abby's more Resident Evil mixed with the evil within. The easiest analogy of that is Ground Zero of the Infection for Seattle and the hotel Skyscraper. Both have you intense encounters with the infected, but Ground Zero takes the cake with its Rat King boss. That shit gives Jack Baker a run for his moldy cheese. The room for creativity is there, and that's all you can really ask for aside from polished mechanics. Abby's melee fights are, pardon the cliche, visceral. Abby has built those muscles for a reason, revenge. And aside from killing Joel, she ends up using them in different ways. She also has different perks, one being a way to chain combo finishers together if you get two back-to-back in a frenzy. The gore lets you know how visceral all of this is. The bullet and explosion wounds are probably the most detailed that I have seen, and that detail extends to every part of the game on a technical level. But for all of this to actually work consistently for such a lengthy runtime, you need some enemy variety, boy. And that is also surprisingly good. The enemies in the first game blended together, they don't here. Every enemy type has personality, including the infected, the stalkers being a highlight, where they literally spy on you from corners, a stark contrast to the blind clickers. The bloater and the new shambler aren't as interesting, but they are behemoths, and that's spooky enough. The human highlights are the Scars, aka Seraphites. They have developed their own combat language with whistling. If they're at a disadvantage, they will become nervous and start speaking normally again. There's a freaking Twitter thread explaining how they got this to work. It's interesting on paper and in gameplay. The AI is probably comparable to fear levels of sentience, but that's an FPS, so the comparison isn't quite valid. The dogs add another layer of strategy where if you snuff out the owner during stealth, the dog will mourn and whimper over the lifeless corpse, allowing for you to take it out with ease. The point is, it all works. Unfortunately, there aren't bugs or jank to weigh all of that down. It's fun and balanced, so I can't really nitpick any of it. It's a format of gameplay that you already know, but polished beyond recognition. These guys know how to make polished games, but they don't always know how to pace them. Uncharted 4 had excellent shooting, but there just wasn't enough of it outside of the multiplayer. This game has a very low amount of puzzles in favor of that fun combat, and it's the right call. I came in expecting a game that would never beat Part 1 in terms of narrative, but this was ultimately more interesting and thought-provoking while being consistently fun. It is drawn out with some unnecessary moments like the pacing of some flashbacks, Abby's first couple of mid-game segments, and then especially that one romance scene with her and Owen, but the story she has is engaging. The collectibles are cheeky and clever in and of themselves. Abby literally collects coins as a mini analogy to the plot, and while Ludo narrative dissonance isn't a new concept, it is worth bringing up. There is something to learn here, whether it's from the game itself or the drama around it. Your ability or inability for empathy in this fictional story is a catalyst for you as a person. If you and others are legitimately still mad after experiencing this game and want Abby to be totally dead, then you are Ellie at her darkest hour and have learned nothing after she already has. I ended up loving this game and its dark outlook on humanity. It's something rare, and I doubt any other big company would have sanctioned this. I don't regret spending my time and money on this game. I'm glad that I did. And many people already see it for what it is. Humanity is mostly fucked, but you can see the silver linings in it. I guess I hope you do too. If you've made it all the way through the video, thank you. And thank fuck for humanity. Or maybe not. That's still up for theoretical, endless, dissonant debate.